Aircraft carriers are cool, but how about flying aircraft carriers? We're not talking about the future. We're in fact talking about the early 1930s. This is a test flight of USS Los Angeles rigid airship trying to recover a plane while using an experimental trapeze system. This test program was a success, which led to the development of aircraft hangars that accommodated up to 5 airplanes on the Akron-class rigid airships. In total, 2 flying aircraft carriers were built for the U.S. Navy, as well as 2 experimental ones used to test new technologies. Unfortunately, 3 out of the 4 rigid airships in the U.S. Navy had a tragic fate. But what killed these giant airships is not what you think. Airships, also known as dirigibles, have 3 types: non-rigid, semi-rigid, and rigid. Non-rigid airships, also known as blimps, rely on the gas pressure to give it its shape, so if a blimp was deflated, it would lose its shape. A rigid airship has an internal structure, giving it its shape within which numerous gas cells are installed. For example, the famous Hindenburg was a rigid airship. A semi-rigid airship is like a blimp but has a partial rigid frame, usually in the form of a keel. The U.S. Navy's rigid airship program began in 1919 when Congress authorized funding to acquire 2 airships and build an air station for the housing and upkeep of the dirigibles. While ZR-1 was built by the United States, ZR-2 was purchased from the British. Unfortunately, even before ZR-2 was able to cross the Atlantic and reach the United States, the airship suffered major structural failure, which resulted in a Hindenburg-like major in-air explosion of 14 hydrogen-filled gas bags. Unlike ZR-2, the American-designed ZR-1, which later was christened as USS Shenandoah, was filled with 2.1 million cubic feet of helium. This gave the airship a significant safety advantage over the hydrogen-filled airships, as helium is non-combustible. The third airship, USS Los Angeles, or ZR-3, was built in Germany by the Zeppelin Company as part of the reparations following World War I. Because of the Treaty of Versailles, Luftschiffe Zeppelin were not allowed to build military ships, and thus ZR-3 was built as a passenger airship. Once the construction of ZR-3 was completed, it was filled with hydrogen and left Germany for a transatlantic delivery flight on October 12, 1924. The trip took 81 hours. Upon arrival, USS Los Angeles was to be reinflated with helium in order to increase safety. But due to the lack of supply of helium at the time, the decision was made to transfer helium from USS Shenandoah to the new airship until more helium became available. It is estimated that USS Shenandoah utilized most of the world's reserves of helium gas at the time. So despite helium's safety advantage, its biggest drawback at the time was its scarcity and price. And this was important because of the way airships operated. Even though the airships were filled with hydrogen or helium in order to rise, some of the gas needed to be vented out during flight in order to adjust the altitude. The adjustments in altitude could have been needed based on how sunny or cloudy it was, the temperature gradients as the airship flew through them, or even simply the airship's loss of weight as its engines burned fuel. This was important to the extent that water recovery systems were installed around the airship's engines to recover water from the exhaust gases to compensate for the loss of weight. So while Germans typically began a Zeppelin flight with gas cells inflated to 100% capacity and then valved hydrogen as the ship lifted up, the Americans were not able to afford the loss of helium, so they would operate with lower initial inflation levels and therefore with less lift. Since USS Los Angeles was by treaty limited to non-military use only, a pair of new airships was authorized by the U.S. government in 1926, USS Akron as ZRS-4 and USS Macon as ZRS-5. These airships' mission was to serve as scouting and reconnaissance platforms. The dirigibles were to be the eyes of the fleet. Furthermore, the two new airships were to act as airborne aircraft carriers, with each airship carrying a small squadron of aircraft that were to be used for self-defense and also to extend scouting range beyond the horizon. At the time, there was a lot of support for flying aircraft carriers, but there were also numerous critics who warned that rigid airships were vulnerable to air attacks and intense weather conditions. The construction of the new airships was a joint venture between Goodyear and Luftschiffbau Zeppelin. As part of the deal, the German company was to send out their experts to train Americans on how to design and build airships. The airships were built at Goodyear AirDot, a newly constructed hangar in Akron, Ohio. While traditional Zeppelin designs were composed of a series of main rings made from a single reinforced girder, Akron-class ships were made of deep rings, which had two rings connected by supports that formed triangles all around the circumference of the ring. Despite being heavier, deep rings offered greater strength and tremendous access to interior portions of the dirigible. Another key difference with traditional designs was the installation of engines within the hull itself, since Akron-class airships use helium as a lifting gas. The advantages of this design included easier maintenance of the engines and reduced drag. In total, 8 Maybach VL2 12-cylinder gasoline-powered engines were installed on each airship, which were capable of propelling it to a maximum speed of 69 knots. Nice! Finally, the propeller shafts were rotatable, allowing for forward and reverse thrust as well as downward thrust, which was useful during landings. As an airborne aircraft carrier, both USS Akron and USS Macon were designed with 4 individual hangar bays for each individual aircraft. A 5th aircraft would have been stored on the trapeze. These airships could launch and retrieve aircraft through a T-shaped opening in the floor of the hangar. Each plane had a metal hook welded in, called a skyhook. For launching, the aircraft were hooked on within the hangar and lowered through the hangar door. Pilots then had to rev up their engine RPM, yank a release lever, and drop into the air mid-flight. The retrieval process worked in reverse, as first the pilot had to match their speed to the dirigible and then gently guide a small hook back onto the trapeze, and the aircraft was then lifted back into the airship. USS Akron was also fitted with a spy basket that looked something like a small airplane fuselage. The idea was for the dirigible to remain hidden in the clouds, while the spy basket was lowered beneath the cloud cover with an observer acting as the ship's eyes. The very first time that the spy basket was tried, it was fitted with sandbags instead of a human, and rightly so, as it was frighteningly unstable. It swung like a pendulum. The problem was eventually solved by adding a ventral stabilizing fin. USS Akron was commissioned in October of 1931 and USS Macon in June of 1933. As the airships entered service and exercises began, 2 things became apparent. The addition of the air group to the dirigible was clearly advantageous, but not in the way that was originally planned. It was initially anticipated that the 5 embarked Curtiss F-9C Sparrowhawk aircraft were to be primarily used by air defense, while the dirigible itself conducted scouting and thus proceeded over the enemy. However, the second realization was that the airship was extremely vulnerable when attacked. In fact, during exercises, USS Macon was frequently shot down on many occasions by both aircraft and anti-aircraft fire. For these 2 reasons, the U.S. Navy decided to alter the mission of the airship from direct scouting to being an authentic flying aircraft carrier. The carrier was to dispatch and control the air group for reconnaissance missions while staying away from harm's way, and this new concept worked. During exercises in 1934, USS Macon was able to locate aircraft carrier USS Saratoga and keep her under surveillance for several hours. With the change in the airship's mission, the Sparrowhawks were also modified by removing their undercarriage and installing external fuel tanks, which increased the aircraft's scout area to 200 miles from the airship. And this is where the success part of the video ends. U.S. Navy's airships suffered from a range of minor to major accidents. In one instance, 3 sailors got stuck in the mooring lines of an airship and were lofted up into the sky, with only 1 sailor making it out alive after holding onto the line for 2 hours. But it gets worse. On November 3, 1925, USS Shenandoah was caught in a squall line over Ohio. The storm bounced the airship like a tennis ball, and the airship rose and fell due to the updrafts and downdrafts. As a result, the ship broke in half and crashed onto the ground, but luckily, most of the crew survived. On April 4, 1933, USS Akron unknowingly flew right into one of the strongest storms that had swept the North Atlantic states in 10 years. USS Akron crashed into the sea with only 3 survivors out of a crew of 76. Most casualties were caused by drowning and hypothermia, as the crew had not been issued any life jackets. Less than 2 years later, during a stormy day on February 12, 1935, USS Macon got caught in a wind shear off the coast of California, resulting in a structural failure. But luckily, the airship was able to land onto the sea before it eventually sank. Due to warmer water temperatures and the introduction of life jackets after the USS Akron disaster, 74 out of the 76 crew members survived. Following these accidents, the U.S. Navy stopped building rigid airships, and that was the end of it for the airborne aircraft carriers. According to the U.S. Naval Institute, intense weather vulnerabilities of dirigibles turned out to be their primary point of failure, eventually killing the entire program. So in the case of dirigibles, seems like the critics had correctly predicted the intrinsic weakness of the airships. In the end, USS Los Angeles was viewed as the most successful U.S. rigid airship, with about 4,400 hours of successful flight in the U.S. Navy service before the airship was dismantled in 1940. The German-built USS Los Angeles was the only dirigible in the U.S. Navy that did not meet a disastrous end. Was it the German engineering or just a coincidence?